Now, please welcome thredUP's co-founder and CEO, James Reinhart, who will be interviewed by Hillary Milnes, Executive Americas editor at Vogue Business.
My pocket. I'm looking for a come-up. This is
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be here. Welcome, James.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Congrats on the award. Did you
Thank
plan
you.
that?
It's great.
So we are here to talk about thredUP, resale, and sustainability. thredUP has had a really big year. You went public. So can you tell us a little bit about the recent boom in resale and how you guys have scaled to rise to the occasion of this demand?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. We were talking when Shop Talk started. 2016. I think the resale panel was in like a closet, and now the resale panel's on the main stage. So I think resale is definitely having its moment, and it's really being driven by consumers. You're seeing more people shop secondhand than ever before. More people are selling than ever before. And I think it's not just being young people that are driving this. I think it's a broad movement around sustainability and value. So very exciting time, and we're thrilled to be a leader in the movement.
Yeah, and why don't you give us a look under the hood? How has thredUP's ecosystem changed a bit? You have the sellers and the buyers, of course. Now you're working with brands directly. How has that evolved, and what role has technology played to drive that change?
Yeah, I think the big thesis was that you needed to make it super easy for the consumer. And so everything that we've done in our infrastructure, technology, software has been about making it easy for the seller and for the buyer. And so our thesis was that if you made it hard to do the good thing, to do the right thing, you couldn't get the adoption that you would like. And so we now have 4 distribution centers around the country. We process more than 100,000 pieces of unique clothing every day, and have processed now 125 million garments across our network. The facility that we're building in Dallas will hold 10 million unique pieces of clothing. Mm-hmm. So imagine 4 football fields wide and then 4 stories tall. That's sort of the Willy Wonka experience of resale at thredUP. But again, it's all about the technology behind that.
Yeah, and when it comes to the entire resale market, we've seen a lot of consolidation. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of players, and now that there's more interest, it seems like the competition is going to be more fierce than ever. You have brands getting involved directly. How do you look at the landscape and see how thredUP is differentiated?
Yeah, I think as lots of brands are starting to appreciate that this is where the consumer is headed, more people, again, are buying secondhand than ever before. You're seeing companies, thredUP being one of them, that are coming to develop technology and software solutions to support, brands and retailers as well as consumers, as they scale this. And, I think the competition, more than anything for me, is showing that there's so much innovation that remains. The fact that there are wonderful and smart entrepreneurs that are coming into the market to build solutions for brands and for consumers, I think is really exciting. I think I would worry if we were the only guys doing this. But I think it speaks to the momentum in the category that you have companies that are emerging.
Yeah, and how do you explain the past couple of years that we've seen in terms of the rise in resale, and what really caused it? How are we at this place now where it's much more mainstream, more normalized? How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, I think you were starting to see before the pandemic consumers who were starting to appreciate that the things that they were no longer wearing were sitting around in their homes. And if you ask the average person what % of the clothes in your closet do you wear, the average person says I wear less than half. And the reality is we wear about 1/3 of the things in our closet. And if you then start to see how people are being educated around the stuff that we give away, a lot of it ends up in a landfill. And I think one of the things that's starting to click in for consumers, and many of you may not know this, but as good as we think we're doing by donating to Goodwill or Salvation Army or one of those organizations, still about 70% of what gets donated ends up in a landfill. And that's not because anybody is doing a bad thing. It's that there haven't been supply chains and solutions to address this. And so I think what you're starting to see now is companies like thredUP stepping in that are enabling the consumer, right, to participate differently. And I think once the consumer says, oh, I want to do the right thing, and oh, now there's this easy way to do that, I think that's this catalyzing moment. And then I think what happened in the pandemic is there were a couple things that happened. One, we all sat around our homes and we said, we should clean out our closets. And I think that trend has remained sticky. And so I think you really saw this accelerant over the last couple of years.
And you mentioned fashion's waste problem. It is a major part of what sustainability strategies are looking to address, and end of life, circularity is a big part of beginning to stem that. Mm-hmm. How is thredUP doing its part to help, especially because you receive a ton of clothing that I'm sure you can't sell or doesn't sell. What do you do with that, and where do you see this problem starting to diminish?
Yeah, I think if you look at the data, and there are independent data providers out there, Global Data, First Insight, that talk about how good resale is for the environment, it really is the best thing you can do, is give a piece of clothing another chance to be reworn. And so we are working on all of the ways to give clothes a second life, but we do get a lot of stuff that we can't sell. About half of what people send us we have to reject because we have very high quality standards. And then we make sure that a lot of that stuff ends up, maybe it ends up in a domestic thrift store, or it ends up being recycled. But we do need, and I think it's incumbent on all of us, we do need new ways to manage this. We're making too much stuff. That is the short of it, right? We're making too much stuff, and we need to figure out better ways to reuse that product. I was talking to the folks at Marine Layer, and I think it's wonderful, what they're doing to take back, right, clothing and then make new clothing. So lots of innovation to come.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about how this younger generation is really interested in sustainability. Do you see the behavior matching what is actually being said? So are we headed in the right direction?
Yeah, it's funny that if you look at the data on Gen Z and millennials, they talk about shopping secondhand at much higher rates than anything else. It's also a generation that's shopping at Shein more than anywhere else. And so I think it's a complicated and nuanced argument around, how sustainable is or these next generations. But I think one thing is clear, which is people want value. And I think secondhand creates a lot of value for the consumer because of its price point. And so I think it's going to remain the challenge for all of us to figure out how do we deliver price points that are sustainable, right? Because I think that's really important.
Yeah, and do you think it's realistic, the path that fashion is on right now, in terms of reaching the sustainability goals we see by 2030, 2050? I know there's some legislation coming, some pressure. We just had the New York Fashion Act, taking place. So I don't know. Are you feeling good about where things are going?
Look, I think the trend lines are really positive, but I think it requires continued vigilance. And I think the New York Fashion Act is a really, really good start. I think it's the opening salvo, though, in this. I think we're headed in fashion to emission standards. We're headed into a world where the government is going to play a role in regulating companies. And I think people who think that that's not going to happen have their heads in the sand, because this is coming for all of us. Fashion is doing too much damage to the environment, and I think the government will step in. And so then I think the question is, what's the role for this community, right, for companies like thredUP to advocate for policies that make sense? Because I think there's a role to play to influence those policies.
Right, and tell us how your conversations with brands have changed over the past few years. Are they more receptive? Are they looking to resale companies to say, hey, we know that we all have our own waste problem. How can you guys help us solve it?
Yeah, I think brands are coming into resale at a very fast rate. So, last year, there are more brands that launched a resale shop, like an actual online resale shop. There are more brands that launched a resale shop in 2022 than launched in all of 2021 and 2020 combined. So you're seeing a lot of momentum from small brands and big brands. We have a very large retailer that we're launching soon that I think will really set the standard for where brands can take this. And so I think what's changing for brands, though, is that it's no longer a question of if they should do this. It's really when and how. And I think what I'm trying to do is play the role of, how do we help you get started? How do we provide you the data that makes sense for brands to get started in this? Because I ultimately believe that's the future.
And of course, if you have just more players in the space in general, there's risk of greenwashing, of overstating how much resale can actually help fashion sustainability problem. Yeah. How do you reconcile with that?
Oh man, how much time do we have? I'm really concerned about the potential for greenwashing in this industry. In particular, brands that are thinking about resale in the context of selling their customer returns. Like, can we be honest that selling your customer returns is not a re-commerce strategy? Like, that's nice, but like that isn't ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, as a community of retailers. And so I think we have to be really careful that we don't allow brands to get off the hook, frankly, by selling some of their returned product and passing that off as really a sustainable circularity strategy. I think that's good. I don't think that's enough. And I think we have to look to leaders in the re-commerce space, and I put thredUP up there to be held accountable to make sure that we're really scaling these platforms. Because right now, if you look at the amount of products that are on offer in a resale context for brands, relative to the total volume that they're selling, like you need a really big microscope, right, to see that.
Right.
And I think it's important that we all hold ourselves to account.
Right, and a big part of that is getting it to happen at scale. So it's not just such a minor piece of the business. What improvements do you see thredUP in a position to make, and what are your own goals for growth?
Yeah, I mean, where we sit, and the reason we're building this massive facility in Dallas is really our commitment to support brands to build programs that really do scale and make a difference. And it's not enough to have a few thousand items listed, right? If you're a brand that's selling $1 billion or $2 billion in sales, and your resale program does 500,000, and it's done 500,000 in the last few years, that's not really getting it done. And so what I'm trying to do and be a real advocate, and I welcome feedback from all of you, is how can a company like thredUP or other companies like us support brands in building a real powerful circularity strategy? Because it requires a take-back program. How do you get product back? It requires authentication in some circumstances, quality inspection, resale. It's a big new supply chain. And my belief is that the disruption that's coming with resale is very much similar to what happened with off-price in the 1980s. And people forget, what an amazing company the TJ Maxx's of the world are. Those companies are 40 years old. It's a disruption that plays over time, and I think we're still in the early stages of all of this.
And as a public company now, you have pressures from investors, your own growth goals and metrics that you're beholden to. How do you do things simultaneously, grow as a company and also do so sustainably?
Yeah, I think as a new public company, I think if you look at the history of great public companies, they never do just one thing really well. Every great public company has a second act. It has a third act. And those second and third acts are being written now. And so what I would say is that I'm thinking a lot about, when we were talking about resale as a service, what we do for brands, that's been incubating, at thredUP for 4 or 5 years now. And we're working on products and services today that we won't launch until 2025 or 2026. And so what I think makes a great public company is the ability to say, hey, what are those next acts? I think a company like Netflix is a great example, right? Where it was a company that started with DVDs, but all the while knew that streaming, right, was its next act. And while streaming was taking off, knew that original content would be its next act. And if you think that Netflix hasn't been working on games for a decade, you're kidding yourself, right? They've been working on a game strategy for 10 years. And so I really hold myself and my team to a standard of what are those next things.
And do you have any advice for people in the audience or other executives who might want to make sustainability a core part of their business, but aren't sure that their investors are going to see that as a valuable investment?
Yeah, I mean, I think every brand and retailer here probably cares about the planet, right? Cares about sustainability. I think I would say in the context of resale is giving yourself permission to get started. I think sometimes there is this inertia of we have to get it all right. And I think one thing that I'm really, in the conversations I have with other CEOs and head executives is, what's a way to get started, get some data, get some customer feedback? What does a pop-up strategy look like for resale, right? All of us are willing to do pop-ups in small contexts to experiment. What does that look like in a resale context, whether that's offline or online? And really not make sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot by trying to get it all right, out of the gate, because it's complicated.
Right, so it's giving that opportunity for experimentation, maybe failure, and then keeping on building. So
Absolutely.
We talk about circularity a lot. Do you think it's the right goal that fashion should be working towards? We know we hear it's like a buzzword now. Basically,
Yeah.
it's end of life. Is it actually achievable for an industry like fashion?
It is achievable. It's not easy, but I think if every brand took seriously the idea that everything we produce, we have a point of view on what happens at the end of its life, that's an amazing outcome, right? If we just got that right, that we all agreed that, hey, let's have an end-of-life point of view for this shirt or this sweater, that goes a long way. And then I think there are new companies, supply chains, logistics, technology companies that are coming to fill that market, to do that right. But it starts with caring about how this all shakes out. And it starts with caring about the fact that so much of it ends up in a landfill today. And I think there are two things that can happen. I think one is companies take it seriously and they get in front of it and they really do make the world better, get acknowledgement from the customers. The other approach is there's regulation.
Right.
And I think the second one, the regulatory environment, is a much worse outcome than the first.
You think brands don't want to see that happen?
No, I don't know, but nobody, there's a role for government, but I think we'd all agree that, we don't want government coming in and explaining how it should run.
Right. And on that note, do you think the responsibility for fashion in becoming more sustainable, is that on the consumer side? Is it the business side? We hear a lot this idea that customers will vote with their dollars, but I don't know. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think consumers would love to shop more sustainable products. They would love, and the data is actually pretty compelling when you ask consumers around consumer preference around, companies who are transparent about, their supply chains. Like consumers overwhelmingly say that they would prefer to purchase from a brand. We actually published data last year that showed, definitely a real increase in consumers. If a brand offered, say, a resale or a take-back program, that was very positively reflected in consumer sentiment. So I think that's what the consumer wants, and I think we have to figure out a way to give it to them.
So what does the 5-year roadmap look like for thredUP? 10-year roadmap, what do you guys have coming up next?
Well, when I zoom out, I think the stage of the resale industry that we're in like the Honda Insight, like ugly Toyota Prius stage. Like, remember that stage? That was like 10, 12, 15 years ago where the people who bought Priuses would tolerate like an ugly electric car. I think that's where we are. I think what you're gonna see over the next 5 to 10 years is like the Tesla stage, where it really is manifested in consumer preference. Consumers wanna do it, it's going to be cool, you're gonna see dramatic innovation and evolution in the space, and we wanna be there to support that. So I think it's gonna be super exciting, but I think we're just getting started, I think, for resale.
Yeah, any new announcements, anything you're going up against this year? What do you have, what's coming up?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're gonna see from us is a surprising number of platform developments that ultimately enable brands. So I think what you're gonna hear, if you keep an eye on thredUP, is some pretty impressive brand partnerships that will roll out that I think will really catalyze brands and the resale industry to get moving. I think there's something about when you see your competitor launch something like big, awesome, and sexy that somehow gets people moving a little faster. So I think you're gonna see that. I think the second thing is, going back to the role of government, one of the things I'm really passionate about is that if government really wants us to do secondhand and resale, whether that's in apparel or any industry, I don't know why they have to tax it. And so we already pay sales tax the first time. Like if government really wants us to build reuse in, what's the role of sales tax? And so one of the things I'm personally really passionate about is figuring out how to not have people pay sales tax on secondhand goods.
Right, so it's incentivizing the businesses, but also the customer.
Yeah, I think there's a role for government in that. Yeah.
What's your most bold prediction when it comes to resale? Is it gonna eventually be half of all retail sales?
I don't know I wouldn't go on record on like a percentage of sales, but I think we will be, if we were to come back here 5 years from now, I think the conversation will be how fast brands' resale businesses are growing and how fast the penetration is for the consumer, and not like a question of whether they're going to get started. And if you think about where we were 5 years ago in the shop talk closet,
Yeah.
and I think it's going to be a super exciting time for the industry, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Great, yeah. Well, here we are on the big stage. Well, we're out of time, but thank you, James, so much. It was great speaking with you, and thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you. Thanks, Hillary.
Thanks.